G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ideas Matter, featuring me, Alex. I've made a return.
Welcome back, Alex.
Here with Louis and our interview guests, the indomitable Dan Crowley.
Indomitable. I didn't realise I was back for a return episode as well. That's a special landmark. Nice to be here.
Dan's here today to talk about his master's research, which is a continuation of your honours research as well, I believe. Dan's a man of many talents, which will become apparent in this conversation. Scholar of ancient Greece.
It's true.
Stand-up comedian.
That's also true.
Failed political hack.
Yeah, that's sadly also true.
Yeah. I'll let you put it in your own words. You'll do it better justice. How would you describe the subject nature of what you're doing?
Yeah. So I suppose I say that I'm interested in history, but I suppose when I say that, it's a bit misleading sometimes because I'm not so much interested in what actually happened. I don't really care about kind of minute bits of historical trivia, like what happened on this day and how many soldiers were there at this battle, which some historians, bless them, really, really care about and spend years obsessing over. I suppose I'm more interested in the sort of philosophical side of history and more of the social side of history in terms of what does it mean to us? Like, what does it mean to be a person that's situated in time, and what does it mean to tell stories about the past, and how does that factor into our identity? And so I suppose as a classicist, I'm kind of looking at that in the ancient context, but it's kind of universal in a way. Like, what is history? What does it mean to do history?
Philosophical side of history, so you come to the right podcast.
Yeah, and I personally, I don't know about you guys, but I believe that ideas matter, so it's a good home for me. Yeah,
absolutely. I guess my first question then would be, because this followed on from your honours thesis.
Yeah.
But I know even before that you've been interested in history for a long time. So I guess, could you give an intellectual history of Dan Crowley as it relates to this topic? Like, how did you first become interested in it, and then how did it evolve? How did it end up where you are now?
Yeah. So I suppose part of what really drew me to classics in particular, ancient Greek as well in particular, is that it's a real kind of cross-section of lots of different areas of study. So you don't just have to limit yourself to one particular area. Like, if you just study history as a discipline, you do history. If you do philosophy, you do philosophy. But because you're just looking at ancient stuff, there's so much ancient stuff, and you can kind of have more of a license to kind of find the little interconnections between things and do a bit of kind of cross-discipline stuff. And so that was kind of what really drew me to classics in the first place. Apart from just the love of the language itself, I really love languages and studying that part of it. But yeah, I suppose kind of early on in my degree, I was really drawn to kind of finding some of those little interconnections, and really enjoyed reading Herodotus, the Greek historian, who we'll talk a bit about today. And I suppose when I read Herodotus in Greek 5 a few years ago, I had an amazing professor who was my honours supervisor, Ed Jeremiah, and he really encouraged me to write this quite speculative essay. I read it back the other day, and some of it is a bit, I don't know, I'd write it in different ways, but it was kind of trying to apply modern psychology to Herodotus in a way, and kind of looking at the area of psychology which is to do with sort of human bias and kind of flaws in human reasoning, and looking at some of the simplistic ways that Herodotus analyses history and kind of almost trying to psychoanalyze that a little bit. Particularly looking at this thing called the hindsight bias, which is like you look back on things that were very unpredictable at the time, and then in hindsight they look very easy to predict. So that was kind of, I suppose, the basis of it in terms of looking at that sort of subjective side of history. And then I knew I wanted to do my honours on something to do with Herodotus and something in that area, and kind of had a range of stuff that I wanted to look at, and then managed to narrow it down to this thing called the plupast, which is basically when an author in a history text depicts history as a discipline. So in the case of Herodotus, it's like, well, he's an historical storyteller, but he also tells stories about other historical storytellers. It's like his characters also tell stories about their past. And so I was kind of looking at like, what's the significance of that? And there was kind of like a very preliminary body of research that had been done on it that hadn't really been done very well. And so I sort of challenged a lot of that. But I suppose, again, it was looking at, like, how did he depict this process of historical storytelling and what it meant for people in the past as like a history of history in a way. And then that's led into my master's, which is kind of on a similar area. Yeah.
Well, just to orient us a bit, could you tell us, well, you mentioned Herodotus is an ancient Greek historian, but could you give us a bit of detail about what his approach was and why he's such a important subject of inquiry.
Yeah, definitely. So we call Herodotus the father of history, which is misleading in a way because he's obviously not the first person to be curious about what happened in the past. Like that's just a universal human thing. As long as humans have been around, we've kind of been interested in what happened before us. When we say that he's the father of history, he's the father of history in the sense of history as like a written discipline. He's the father of literary history. He's the first person that we know of to write a history book in the way that we would think of it, in terms of like picking just like a finite amount of time and a region and just looking like tracing some sort of narrative about what happened, and also what didn't happen and kind of ruling out some stories that he doesn't think are true. So Herodotus, we kind of don't know too much about Herodotus, sadly, himself. We know that he was from Halicarnassus, which is sort of in modern day Turkey. So he was kind of on like the eastern fringes of the Greek world. Probably spoke Ionic Greek, which is what he wrote the histories, his major work in. And he kind of lived around sort of the 5th century BC. We don't quite know when he was born and when he died, but we know that he's writing about these sort of events that happened in sort of the late 500s BC into kind of the first half of the 400s BC. And he's writing about the Persian Wars, which are these wars that Greece, particularly Athens and Sparta, fought against the massive Persian Empire. And it was basically the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire in a way where it started to fall apart and Greece started to become the major power, paving the way for the sort of Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, who were battling for control of Greece, and then later into Alexander conquering the Eastern world. In terms of his approach, I think he gets an unfair rap sometimes. He's kind of not treated seriously a lot of the time, at least for a lot of sort of the history of classical scholarship. He's not treated very seriously because he loves his story. Like he just loves to include random bits of facts that he hears. He's not particularly rigorous in terms of like sticking to a theme. Like at the end of book 1, he mentions Egypt and then he gets kind of so sidetracked by Egypt and how cool it is that he writes a whole book just about Egypt that has nothing really to do with the Persian Wars. And he's kind of doing that all the time. He's including little bits about like oracles and some stories about like gods like meeting random Greek messengers and sending them messages and stuff like that. So there's a real kind of supernatural element to it. He's I suppose looked down upon by the people who followed. Thucydides has a massive crack at him in the first 20 chapters of his work where he's kind of setting out his sort of methodology, and he just has a go at Herodotus. Plutarch, who was a kind of later historian and essay writer, wrote this whole essay called De Herodoti Malignitate and the maliciousness of Herodotus, and basically just accused him of making stuff up. And that kind of, continued right on to, even Cicero had some bad things to say about Herodotus. So he's kind of seen as, I suppose, he's not quite all the way there in terms of moving from like myth and epic and that kind of version of history. He's not quite there in terms of transitioning into like an academic historian. That's what people kind of see him as. But I suppose what will hopefully emerge in the conversation today is that's not quite true. He is a storyteller, but I suppose as we'll say, all history is storytelling. And really what Herodotus does, Thucydides does, and every historian does. But I suppose we'll get back into that sort of postmodernist argument later.
Well, that's a nice segue to the stuff that you covered in your literature review, which we read in preparation for this. So, I guess the critique of Herodotus by other historians that you've spoken about is that he doesn't fit this self-depiction as historians or as chroniclers of what actually happened. Just people talking about empirical facts in a sort of very neutral, quote-unquote, objective way. Herodotus doesn't do that. But then you say in this literature review that view of history came under challenge in the 20th century by postmodern, I don't know whether you call them theorists of history or philosophers of history.
Yeah.
Before we get into that in substance, which will be hugely interesting, I feel like the term postmodernism is one that gets bandied about quite a lot, often by people who don't quite know what it means. So before we get into that, could you perhaps, what is postmodernism on your understanding and how is it applied to history?
Yeah. It's I'm probably guilty of being one of those people who throws it out without knowing exactly what it is. In this topic, it's also hard to separate postmodernists from post-structuralists. They're kind of one and the same in a way. But it's basically, as the word kind of literally means, the people who came after modernism. Modernism being this thing that I suppose you can trace back to the start of the Enlightenment, A lot of classical ideas that kind of brought back as well, though, but this kind of emphasis on human reason can do everything. We can systematize everything if we think carefully enough about things. And you can basically like work out the order of things in the world in any field if you study it hard enough. That's kind of modernism in a way, and there's modernist art and trying to really systematize art, and modernist history in terms of trying to do a really, really scientific version of history. And postmodernism is the resistance to that, and it's trying to, I suppose, go back to first principles and really dispute how well you can ever do that, and dispute the idea that like an order of words can ever really approximate an order of things in terms of the world. And that's the post-structuralist, like attacking language and the foundations of language. But I suppose it's a resistance to this idea that the human mind is capable of understanding everything. And postmodernists would emphasize more, subjectivity and poeticism and just the general limits of human reason. Yeah.
I suppose there are two parts to that then. There's like the critique of postmodernism, that these historians who think they're being hyper-rational and systematizing history in this way that might somehow be value neutral, they're deluded about the power of their own ability to do that. So there's a sort of critique element of postmodernism. And maybe I'm wrong, but I sort of got the sense from what you'd written that their postmodernists also think that there is a value in explicitly rejecting that approach and adopting more of a narrative style of writing history.
Totally. It's kind of like an emancipatory sort of streak in postmodernism, which is like once you kind of rid yourself of the shackles of thinking that you have to rigidly just like pour through archive and source material, and you can't say anything unless you've got like a million footnotes that are each 10,000 words long justifying that claim. Once you realize that that's all kind of rubbish and the foundations of that aren't as sound as you think they are, you're then free to be a storyteller and to be a poet and to actually really lean into and embrace that kind of side, that social side, the experiential sort of side of history. And so, there is that kind of liberatory sort of element of postmodernism. Don't do the kind of fuddy-duddy 1,000 word long, history. Or you think of like Gibbon's history of the fall of the Roman Empire, like 20 books or whatever it is. Something that no like casual reader is ever going to read. And it is saying, history should be fun and it should be engaging and it should be moving. Otherwise, what's the point? Yeah.
Right. So we've been touching on the idea of history as kind of unvarnished truth-telling and kind of talking about the postmodern deconstruction of that. But let's just go back to that idea, like that classical conception of history. Yeah. Could you take us through like that kind of old school traditional view of what history is and what it should be?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, like it kind of does start with Herodotus. So Herodotus, unfortunately, he doesn't tell us much about his methodology or what he thinks about this discipline of history. He kind of just starts doing it. But he has this like very short introduction where he firstly introduces the word history for the first time in this context, which is very important. It's the third word of his work. The first two are his name and the place where he comes from, and then the word history. And he basically says this is the exhibition of the history of Herodotus. And the word history comes from the Greek verb historeuo, which is the idea of to inquire about something or to investigate something. And so I suppose it sets up this idea of, history being this idea of going out and, as you say, looking for the facts, going out into the world, hearing what people have to say, looking at different bits of evidence, going through sources and trying to work out what the truth is. And that's where we get the word history, this idea of an investigation. And then the second important kind of word or phrase that he uses is this phrase that Aristotle comes back to later, which is ta genomena, which is the things that happened. And he might even add the word actually there, the things that actually happened. And that's what he says the aim of his history is. It's to make sure that the things that actually happened don't get forgotten by the course of time. So that, again, kind of sets up one of the kind of traditional sort of purposes of history, this idea of making sure that the events that actually happened don't get lost or forgotten. And so those are the kind of the important stuff that Herodotus introduces. And then Thucydides really formalizes it in a much more detailed way. And And this is just a quote from the beginning of Thucydides' work when he's kind of laying out his methodology. And he says here, from the evidence that I have laid out, one can safely assume that events happen just as I have described them. One should also disregard what the poets have sung about these events because they embellish them excessively. Likewise, one should disregard the accounts constructed by chroniclers who are more interested in pleasing their listeners than telling the truth. Their stories are unverifiable, and due to all of the time that has elapsed, they are untrustworthy, like mythology. So that's a pretty good, I think, explanation of what Thucydides sees history as. It's not embellished, it's not exaggerated, it's just the truth. It's, the classic facts don't care about your feelings sort of thing from Thucydides here. And Thucydides probably is a Jordan Peterson type, in that I don't really like him. That is kind of, I suppose, the conception of history. And that's the modernist conception of history, basically, articulated by Thucydides in the year 400 BC. This idea of, as you say, is history is truth-telling, history is fact-finding, and this important idea that an historian finds his story in a way that a poet or a novelist doesn't. So a novelist gets to invent whatever they want, a poet gets to do that, but an historian can't do that. They have to find their story. They have to go out, as we said with the word history, go and investigate and inquire, and then they uncover their stories in a way that, the stories already exist out there in the world. These stories have happened, and the historian just goes and he finds what that is, and then he just very faithfully and in an unvarnished way lays it out for you. So that's the basic idea, and then Aristotle kind of formalizes it even further. Aristotle writes this really famous work called The Poetics, very influential work of sort of literary theory. If you ever study Shakespeare, it's where a lot of modern kind of criticism of Shakespeare comes from, the idea of tragedy and comedy and the idea of heroes having a fatal flaw. This all goes back to this work that Aristotle wrote. And he also wrote on this question of what separates poetry and other genres of fiction from history. And there's this very simple line that's very succinct and pithy where he says, history considers, again he uses this word targenomena that Herodotus used, history considers targenomena, the things that happened, whereas poetry considers, and the phrase he uses is hoia an genoito, which is basically a potential version of that, the kinds of things that could happen or might happen. So that's the distinction. Poets get to speculate on what things could possibly happen in the human condition, whereas the historian has to just say the things that have actually happened to real humans. And Cicero even goes further and he says that history aims entirely at truth, whereas poetry aims mostly at delight. So again, the historian is trying to inform you about what actually happened, whereas the poet is trying to move you in a way. He's trying to appeal to your pathos, or he's trying to inspire you, or whatever a novelist or a poet might try and do. Whereas the historian doesn't get to do that. They don't get that license. They've just got to tell you what happened. So that's this kind of, I suppose, idea emerging, and it comes a lot. It's voiced a lot in a criticism of Herodotus, who they think people like Aristotle and people like Cicero and Thucydides, they think that Herodotus didn't do a very good job of that. He was a bit too much of the storyteller. He wanted to just tell an interesting story. He wanted to just engage his audience at the expense of historical accuracy. And I suppose that one of the most famous sort of articulations of that is when I'm just trying to get his name. Sorry. One second. Abbott, that's right. This scholar called Abbott in the 20s says that Herodotus has been called the father of history. In truth, he is only the father of storytelling. Everybody knows his childlike weakness for portents and prodigies, dreams, miracles, and oracles. He has a love of exaggeration, careless inaccuracy, and an addiction to entertaining anecdote. And so that's the basic idea. An historian shouldn't do that. An historian shouldn't just exaggerate for the sake of telling a cool, fun story. They've got to be very disciplined in a way.
Right. So that's a good outline. So the kind of classical conception, or classical and classic, as in traditional conception of history, is, you're just figuring things out. We're just finding out what's really going on. We're not concerned with anything sort of fictive or anything made up. But as you were talking about, you're interested in the responses to that and the kind of people opposing that conception of history. So how does that come about, and what does that critique look like?
Yeah, so I suppose the first way that you can start to unpick this a little bit is looking at the way in which this conception of history is actually itself an historically contingent idea, and actually not inevitable in any way, but an invention in a way. And I suppose what I mean by that is this period of Greece that we're looking at around the sort of 5th century BC is really a kind of transition period in Greece from a society that is almost entirely based on just oral communication to the kind of society that we live in now, where everything is written down. Most forms of knowledge are written down. Obviously not entirely, but most things are written down. And I suppose the point to make is that in such a society where things can't be written down, when there's just no literacy or even just no written language, no alphabet, it's very hard to have this idea of like there being one historical truth, because how do you possibly know? And I suppose the example is we're very, very literal these days. And, if I were to try to relate some speech that Martin Luther King gave 50 years ago, and I would just to kind of paraphrase it and just kind of, give my version of it, of what I think he said that kind of captured who he was and what I know about him and what he might have thought at the time and kind of some of the spirit and the feeling of it. If I just paraphrase that and tried to publish it and pass it off as his words, I'd be like, I'd be cancelled probably. It would just be kind of outrageous and almost like in a way offensive. But in an oral society where somebody says something and it's not written down and there's no record of it, that's kind of all you can do. If you're kind of trying to write about it 10 years down the track, 50 years, 100 years down the track, you don't have a written record that you can go back and just write something down or just copy it down, transcribe it. You've got to kind of invent in a way. And so this means that, this idea that Thucydides talks about of there being, like you can safely assume that like events happen just as I say they did. That just can't exist in a society where there's no writing, where there's nothing really to refer back to. And so history in this kind of society is very lyrical, it's very fluid, and it's a lot based on kind of storytelling. And like each time you tell an historical story, you tell it in a slightly different way. Whereas that changes, that kind of shifts when writing comes along, and writing kind of lends itself to just having one set of facts. Because you choose one combination of words and you put it in print and it's just there forever. It's just like it's a time capsule. It is as it is. Socrates actually talks about this, and Socrates kind of explains why he doesn't like to write anything down, because he can't rephrase himself when he does that. He can't, if he says something in the wrong way or doesn't quite nail the tone in terms of who his audience is, he can't write it down again. So history, I suppose, this view of history that we have comes along with writing and wanting to find the one set of words that perfectly sums it up. And there's also this element of like in an oral society, the only way that you can preserve information and knowledge is by like I tell you something and I hope that you remember it. That's the only way. Like I could draw a picture of it, but in terms of like complex ideas, I tell you something, I hope that you'll remember it and you'll tell someone else and they'll remember it and so on. It's like knowledge is just preserved through your memory. And there's like an interesting thought experiment you can do to kind of work out just how radical a difference that is. Like imagine you guys woke up tomorrow and you're in some kind of like black void and God spoke to you and said, Louis and Alex, something really embarrassing has happened. All of like human civilization has been wiped out. And kind of like Noah's Ark style, I've had to just pick two people who know the most about every subject and hope that they can remember everything that there was and what happened so that I can recreate it. And I've chosen you two because you guys know the most about philosophy. All right? And you believe that ideas matter, and God also believes that. And what God basically asks you to do is basically reconstruct all of Western philosophy. You can't check books, you can't Google anything. You just have to reconstruct it just by telling him things.
Yeah, we could do it.
You could do it. Yeah, maybe. Just send him the link to your Spotify, and that might help. But like I'm sure you could give a bare bones kind of like overview of like the important developments, but in terms of like the complexity of ideas of every thinker and who they were, and even just like you probably wouldn't be able to remember word for word a single like philosophical book that was written. There's an element of complexity there where an element of sophistication and detail that writing allows that the human memory just doesn't. And the same would be for me and Greek stuff and an electrician who knows stuff about wiring and stuff like that, and an engineer and whatever. Kind of our societies have become, our civilizations have become so complex and so sophisticated because we can write things down. More recently, since we can digitize things, and that's just expanded. You don't need a physical copy of a book. You can just upload it and download it from anywhere. But again, that kind of means that history is very different in a pre-literate society. Like Thucydides is like an enormous book that is like really long and just ponderous. And Louis, you love talking about clear writing. Thucydides is just the worst example of that. It's just terrible Greek, honestly, it is. And you read it, and some parts are just borderline, just it's embarrassing. That I mean, like without writing, if Thucydides would just trying to tell you everything that was in his book, you'd just forget it. Like you'd just tune out. It would be boring. All of that complexity and all of that detail that he includes would just die out. And again, that's only allowed to be preserved through writing, because you write it down and it's there and it exists forever. So again, this idea of like history as being like the one true version of events is not inevitable. It's not some just like fundamental idea. It's something that is technologically based. It only comes about through writing, through this tool that we have, which is like the written word. And so it's not as inevitable as we think it would be. And again, if you were to do some like massive timeline of like human civilization, and a time that would be orally based and a time that would be just based on writing, it would just be like a tiny little fraction at the end where it would just be based on writing. Like we're like a little blip in the overall history of mankind. For hundreds and thousands of years, we haven't had written language, and societies have functioned without it. And so to think that it's just inevitable, or that this is the one version of history that is meaningful or worthy or valid, is quite bizarre in a way. Because we're the weirdos. Like we are just freaks in the way that we do things, compared to any other civilization. So yeah.
You mentioned in your review that the postmodernists criticise modernist historians for thinking that they're presenting this unvarnished account of what actually happened. Mm-hmm. When in reality, most historians, or at least the good ones who write things that are enjoyable to read, are engaging in a certain form of narrative. Yeah. They're telling a story. And I thought it was quite interesting, like your own response sort of illustrated this, is because you gave technology as being the reason why this thing happened in history. So my question is, to what extent do narrative tellings of history differ from simply just having a theoretical interpretation? Because a Marxist account of history will focus on certain facts, not necessarily to tell a story, although it will read as such. I mean, the history of all hitherto existing societies is that of class struggle. I mean, in a certain sense, that's that can be constructed as a narrative, mm-hmm. told as a story, but it's constructed in that way for very rigorous theoretical reasons. Like Marxists think the best way to understand history is to look at these particular facts, these particular social relations, the importance of technology and materialism. So how, if at all, mm-hmm. does a narrative way of telling history just differ from a theoretical interpretation of history? Yeah.
So it's a really, really good question. I suppose the question that is underpinning that is, what is narrative? And it's something that a lot of people don't define. It's kind of like postmodernism. You just throw it out there. But what actually is narrative, and like what is a story? And the best explanation I've come across is it's something that possesses 4 dimensions. So there's the spatial dimension. Like a story has to have like a setting. It's got to have a time. So that's the temporal dimension. It's got to have sort of characters who kind of make decisions. So it's got that mental dimension. They don't have to be humans, but they have to have some kind of personification. And then there's this important element, which is like the theoretical dimension, or it's called the formal and pragmatic dimension. But it's like, what order do things follow? Like, what's the meaning to things? What's kind of the unifying, driving force? And so, yeah, what you're talking about in terms of theoretical approaches to history, it's just one type of narrative. It's a type of narrative in particular where that formal and pragmatic dimension kind of subsumes the rest of it. And it's saying, well, actually, the decisions of characters weren't really that important. The time, this is actually an atemporal story that we're telling about history, right? Like history is just like inexorably heading towards this conclusion in terms of Marxism and the phases of history. And again, the location doesn't matter because this is a universal story that can, again, take place in any society. And so, like, yeah, that kind of theoretical story is one where that fourth dimension takes on a real significance. But there are other stories where the mental dimension is really important. We might tell a history of the Second World War where we focus on the actions of particularly notable leaders like, Adolf Hitler and Stalin and, any other leader you like. And, we might say that like a particular event hinged on one like brave decision they made. When like in actual fact, we know that like a range of other forces were at play, and you can get into like the guns, germs, and steel stuff or the butterfly effect stuff, and talk about how there's all sorts of other counterfactuals and stuff like that. But that might be one particular story where we emphasize that one, and then we might tell a story that really emphasizes the idea of time and like the sense of like time passing and what that was like for people to live through. And like a good example would be like histories of whole civilizations, where we're not so much interested in like one particular event and what caused it, but looking at like how the civilization has changed over time, and like how an empire, like the Roman Empire, for example, moved between different phases of governance or whatever. And then again, we might just tell like a history of a particular region where we're really interested in like what happened in this particular place over different periods and like how has it changed. So I think what you're describing is like is a type of historical narrative, definitely, but it's just one sort of particular kind where again that idea of like the logical order just starts to subsume everything else. But the postmodernist innovation, I think, is to say that what the modernists would say is that they sit outside of narrative in a way. They're not making these narrative decisions. They're just like telling stories as they were. Again, they're finding these stories. They're uncovering these stories. And a postmodernist would laugh at that because stories don't exist outside of us and our minds. Like, we create stories. There's no such thing as a story that just exists in nature. Like, we have to go and look at nature and create a story that makes sense to us. We construct that. So all of history, again, is just a construction of narrative. Right? Things just happen. They don't happen in the form of a story with a beginning, a middle, an end, and a plot, and character development, and a message, and all of those things. That's not how reality happens. Reality, things just happen. People experience things, and then we look back on them. We look back at the debris of the past, the things that were kind of left behind, and the little fragments that we have, and we create a story about it. And you can create stories in all sorts of different ways, but this idea that you can somehow sit above that, be sort of above the fray in a way, is just like, again, it's laughable. Like, you can't, because like stories are things that we make. Everyone's going to be doing that. No matter how many footnotes you have in your work, no matter how many volumes you write, you're still going to have to make those narrative choices. You're still going to have to think about, where does this story happen? When does it happen? Who does it affect? And what is the driving force? Or maybe you can sit outside of that, but it's going to be a very different kind of history than we're used to. It's going to be just like a bare bones, just like describing literally every single thing that ever happened from every single vantage point. And it's going to be totally nonsensical and totally useless. And it's going to be millions and millions and millions of books long. And so, yeah, if we want to write history that has any kind of significance for us, then we kind of have to stop just turning up our nose at narrative and saying that that's something that the bad historians like Herodotus do. We're the good historians, we don't do that. We're like Thucydides. Again, that's just totally not true. Yeah.
So what you're saying is Herodotus was right all along.
Herodotus was right all along. I'm a Herodotus truther through and through. Call me like the Alex Jones of the classical world. I'll die on that hill.
We've been red-pilled here today. You mentioned some really interesting things about like the contingency of things happening, because most of my like academic training, I suppose, is in international relations, and the starting question for international relations is, why does war happen? And then you'd be more specific, well, why did World War II happen? The trouble with that is that we can't rewind history, or we can't run a control study to make more wars happen, to study their causes, right? So the method of IR is like hotly contested. And one of the methods is historical counterfactuals. You go, well, okay, in the lead up to the outbreak of World War I, what if, X wasn't the case? And my superficial reading of it is that some historians are okay with that sort of asking counterfactual questions about history, whereas other historians think that's just nonsensical. You go, well, what do you mean things could have been another way? Things just... It seems it's like some historians are almost implicitly determinist. Everything was happening. It could have not happened any other way. It was always going to happen that way. So to ask a counterfactual question about history is nonsensical.
Yeah.
I guess, what's your thought on that approach to asking questions of history?
Well, I think the postmodernists would say there's no such thing as an historical factual to begin with. The idea of a counterfactual is you're saying that things were different than they were, and the postmodernists would say, well, how are you defining what things were? How do you know? Like, how do you have this kind of, again, this story of like what happened, and how do you say that it's true and then another version isn't true? Again, these things are subjective human creations. What does it mean to say one story is true? You can say one story is more plausible, or again, it's more moving. It kind of seems to have the ring of truth, but you can't say that it's true. Because again, we just created these things. Like, what are you comparing these against? And so I think the postmodernists would say, go right ahead, go and do the historical counterfactual. What you're doing there is no more slippery than what an historian does, right? It's all just narrative. It's all just subjectivity. It's all just storytelling and creativity and invention. So go right ahead. But yeah, I suppose you have to then be able to justify your project in some kind of aesthetic way, or some kind of poetic way, or some kind of like functional way, and talk about why what you're doing is actually useful for people and why it's enlightening and illuminating. But this idea that with history we're ever going to be able to tell a story that is true is something that we have to do away. I'm not saying that I agree with this, but this is the kind of the postmodernist idea. The basic thing is that, like, bits of historical artifacts can be like true or not. Like, we can like say, well, look, there's a ruin there. Like, we can see the foundations of that. But in terms of like coming up with any kind of story that has those dimensions and has something that will make sense to us in terms of like what, where, when, why, and who did it affect, all of those stories are just going to be inventions. And so go ahead. Again, that's the kind of the liberatory element of postmodernism. Go right ahead and do that. But don't delude yourself into thinking that what you're doing is science. You're doing the same thing that a storyteller is doing, the same thing that a novelist is doing, with different constraints and different sort of sensibilities that your audience is going to have. Because, again, you can't just make up historical evidence that just seems ludicrous, and you can't just like say aliens descended to Earth last week if people were here and they know that they didn't, and nobody in their family told them that 100 years ago aliens came or whatever. So you can't just totally make up stuff like that. But in the end, what you're doing is still a kind of aesthetic literary project in the same way that a novel is. Again, with different critical constraints, but it's the same thing. So that would be, I suppose, the extreme postmodernist response to you, which is like, yeah, it's all fair game. Go ahead. So
where then do you stand in relation to the idea of historical truth? So you just indicated the postmodernist position, or the extreme one, that it's kind of nonsensical to talk about there being such thing as a historical truth. But what do you reckon on that? I feel like the average person listening to this is going to have an instinctual kind of negative reaction to that idea that, well, yeah, sure, there's always subjectivity tied in with how we view the past, but surely there's some sense that we can sort of like figure out something of what actually happens.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's lots of different ways you can go with it. So one way to do it is, I suppose, to just kind of retreat to what we do know is like true, and so like, and just being very cautious in the way that you talk about history. So that's one way you can kind of navigate it. So I'm actually not going to make any claims about like what anything meant. I'm not going to make any claims about why, but I'm just going to tell you like the base historical facts that are indisputable in terms of like, this is the stuff that you can see with your own eyes. You can go out and see the debris. And this is often called like pointillist history. You think of like pointillist paintings with like the little dots that aren't connected. It's kind of like that in a way. It's like you're just describing what the bits of historical debris are, and people can kind of see their own pattern in it as they want to, but you're not actually kind of connecting the dots for them in a way. Little bits of unconnected historical trivia. I find that quite boring, and I think, you're right. Like a lot of historians just kind of ignore this stuff, and there's quite a funny element in which like postmodernism almost never really happened in a way, because historians have just kind of kept going on as if this just never happened. And they keep writing their history books in exactly the same way. They keep just going to conferences and talking about things in exactly the same way as if none of this ever happened. It's kind of like an interesting thought experiment, but at the end of the day, useless. And there's this great quote. I can't exactly remember who said it, but this idea that like postmodernism baits us with this like the siren call of liberation and creativity, but it might actually be a call to intellectual suicide. You know, like the sirens inviting sailors in to die. And there is an element to like if you fully buy into this postmodernism, you end up just completely throwing academic rigor out the door, which I don't think we want to do. I think there is a middle ground, and there's a body of scholarship that tries to work out what that middle ground might be. There's a great article by Nancy Partner and a few other scholars who kind of work out what this might be. Elizabeth Fox Genovese is another great one. But I suppose what it would be is saying kind of what I said before, which is you can't just totally fabricate stuff that people just instinctively know isn't true. If it just doesn't pass the sniff test in a way, people aren't going to buy it. So you do have to take your source material seriously, and you have to make some effort to create a story that fits the parts that like people can see with their own eyes, and point to evidence that people will kind of rationally be able to make sense of. But at the same time, I don't think you should become consumed by this fantasy that you can create the one true version of events, and that you can spell out in perfect detail exactly what happened, and that will be indisputable in a way. Like you're pursuing a goal that just doesn't exist. Because again, like as soon as you stray into the territory of even just looking at like time and just trying to describe how time passes, but even the thornier stuff in terms of, again, what does it all signify? What does it all add up to? What does it mean in the end of it all? As soon as you do that, you're straying into storytelling. So I think just acknowledge that, and then just ignore postmodernism, and I think you can just continue pretending that it doesn't exist, as long as you almost have the humility to say, again, you might be able to prove me wrong, and you might be able to come up with a better story. But I'm at least trying, and I'm self-aware in a way, and I'm not going to be too arrogant, right? I'm not going to have the total just like submission to postmodernism in terms of just not even trying to say something that's accurate. But I'm also not going to have the hubris to think that what I'm doing is a science. It's not. History it's an art form. I think that's important to understand. Again, it's not the same kind of art form as like just writing a poem from scratch or writing a novel, because again, there are different sort of constraints that you're operating within, and people are going to judge it in different terms. But yeah, it's not a science. And I think that's an important legacy of postmodernism, and it allows us to be a bit less fussy, a bit less precious, and just enjoy some of the stories that people like Herodotus have told us. They're good stories. They're quite illuminating in that kind of human psychological way. Even if you can point to some particular battle and say, well, he says there are 100,000 soldiers, and in actual fact there were 12,000. The overall message of the story can still be affecting and moving in a way.
So if we abandon this idea that we can ever construct or perhaps reveal a single true objective account of history, and in a sense different histories are narratives, is there a place left to stand to adjudicate between different narratives? And I'll give a concrete example. Apologies to our international listeners, the Eureka Stockade.
Mm-hmm.
So just for most of our listeners are actually American. In the 1830s was the gold rush? When was it?
1851.
1851. So 1851, like people from all around the world come to Victoria in the same way they went to California to pursue the gold rush. And basically, they had to pay a license fee to dig for gold. Mm-hmm. And this eventually erupted in huge protests. And what's interesting in Australia is that this occurred before Federation, but it's taken up by both sides of the political spectrum. So the left, sometimes you'll see unionists wearing the Eureka flag, which was flown at the Eureka Stockade, where they like had a shootout with the troops. So the left will say, well, this is like the working man versus the aristocracy fighting against harsh working conditions. They're just trying to make ends meet. It's the birthplace of unionism in a certain sense. Whereas the political right will say, no, this was about unfair taxation. It was a protest in favour of limited government. So you have these two competing narratives over how to interpret this really important event in history. Now, provided that both sides don't just fabricate facts, they're both talking about what actually happened, do you think there's any way to say one of these interpretations or one of these narratives of the Eureka Stockade is better, air quotes?
Yeah, so I mean, again, a postmodernist would say no, because they would say if there's no such thing as objective truth, then there's no such thing as a partial truth in a way. Like if there's no full truth, how can you say something is partially true or more true than something else? What I would say is like, think about it in the same terms as you might judge a novel, right? And you can read a novel and a character might react in a certain situation in a way that you just don't find relatable or plausible. You just think like, yeah, I just don't think a person in that situation would choose to do that. I just don't quite get that. I love Sally Rooney's work, but it's a prominent criticism sometimes of Sally Rooney's characters. You know, like they just don't quite act in a way that I think a normal person would in that situation. And it's not that her story is untrue in an like objective scientific way, because I'm sure a human could like act in that way. It's possible, but there's something just kind of uncanny about it, and something that just doesn't quite strike us as being realistic or kind of poetically true. I think it's almost the same when it comes to history. Like an explanation of history can just like try and explain the facts that we can ascertain and the things that we can see with our own eyes. But it might just not quite do a good job. I think, again, go away from saying that it's definitely not true or it's provably false in a way. Again, and judge in the same way that you would a novel. It just doesn't quite do a good enough job of speaking to me in terms of like being a cogent, reassuring explanation or whatever. But again, this idea that you're going to be able to say that it's provably, like factually untrue is just kind of not possible. I mean, like it can. I mean, again, it can be. If people are fabricating stuff, then you can just say, well, like it's just like a complete invention. But again, these are subjective questions. They're questions of degree. They're questions of aesthetics in a way. So start judging history in the same way that you would judge a novel, I would say. Yeah.
I didn't know that was a common criticism of Sally Rooney.
Yeah.
But now that you say it, I'm like, yeah, that's very true. I read Normal People.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of like the way that her characters felt was like, I mean, Rooney's a Marxist, and so she's constructing these characters who react to the world in a way that's like making a Marxist point. Mm-hmm. So there's this whole, what's the male character's name?
Connell.
Connell. Where he's like, she describes him being, she doesn't use the word alienated, but she's describing like Marxist alienation and his response to this certain situation. And yeah, because it's so consciously trying to make that point, the way that she describes his behaviour, is just not plausible. It seems uncanny.
Not very normal people.
Yeah, ironically titled. And similarly, like we just had a class this morning, I had an interpretation of Hobbes, and just pulling out quotes of Hobbes and saying like, actually Hobbes wasn't concerned with power, he was a Pyrrhonian skeptic, and he was concerned with epistemic relativism. And I was like, okay, well this quote from Hobbes isn't wrong, but this is such a stretch that it's just not plausible.
Yeah.
So are you saying that that's...
Yeah, it's like that. It's like often I think of like political theories in a way that like try and formalize and explain everything. This is kind of what you're saying. And you might think about like libertarian philosophy, where it's trying to say that like, you know, the only crime is property crime, and like that's the only rule, that you can't violate someone's property. And then they'll stretch themselves to say that any time a human is upset about something, it's something to do with property. When obviously that's kind of not true, because you have all sorts of like emotional needs that go beyond things that we own. And it's like it's not like what they're saying is, again, like provably false in a way, but it's like you're trying to get as much leverage out of a particular idea or a particular theory as you can, and then sometimes it just starts to stretch, and sometimes you need a whole new kind of way of interpreting things, and that might be a Marxist way of interpreting things, or whatever it is, a Catholic distributivist or whatever floats your boat. And it's the same with history. Like a particular historical work will have a particular set of answers to those like dimensional questions in terms of when it happened, where it happened, who it happened, why it happened, and you'll get a certain amount of mileage out of it. But at a certain point, maybe it just won't it'll get that kind of uncanny element that a Sally Rooney. Again, I don't think Sally Rooney's novels do. I love her writing. I'm a huge fan, but that some people think that it does. It has that uncanny quality, maybe. And again, what we're talking about is interpretation. We're not talking about science and maths or something like that. We're talking about interpretation. Again, history is an art form. I think we've lost that. I think the discipline has really lost that. Sartre, this was a big theme of Sartre's work, and like a lot of the villains in his characters were like boring fuddy-duddy historians who like the more they study history they just can't be bothered doing anything in the present because everything good has ever happened, and you know they're just so caught up in the past. And there's a really interesting article about that, about like sort of the existentialists and what they had to say about history and just how philosophically dead it was and how it just left you depressed because everything had already been done, or the past was bleak and there was no possibility of doing something new and different. And I think history has lost that idea that it's an art form. It's become so consumed in just facts and just like the most boring, minute debates about like, does this source say this, does it not, whatever, and just like again pouring through footnotes and just spending hours and hours in archives. And it's like, again, that's important to a certain extent because, again, your story has to ring true and it has to be plausible and has to connect in some way to reality. But history is an art form. Like historical stories, when they're at their best, should be moving in the same way that a novel should be. And that's what's been lost in the discipline. That's what Herodotus does so well. That's why I love his work compared to Thucydides, because Thucydides is just boring, man. It's just the worst to read. But you read Herodotus and it's like it was written 2,500 years ago, but it feels like it could be written today, and it feels like the people you're reading about could be right there in front of you. And it rings true in a way that Thucydides stuff just doesn't. Like it actually makes comments about human nature and the human condition that you think like, yeah, man, that's true. And it moves you in a way that history writing today often doesn't. So a bit more creativity, a bit more freedom, if that's the kind of the legacy of postmodernism, just to loosen us up a bit, then great, I say, yeah.
Right, so you've given a huge plug for Herodotus. So if anybody's listening to this pod and likes the sound of that, please go have a read of Herodotus.
Absolutely.
Is there anyone else, history-wise, that you feel is in a similar vein of doing this like fun, novelistic, creative, engaging history style?
Yeah, there's lots. There's lots of narrative history out there today. I would say like creative nonfiction and like memoirs these days are doing like a really good job of it. And like a real cynic would say that memoirs are just like, it's all just artificial and you're all just like looking back retrospectively and making stuff up or whatever. But I think that kind of fusion of like poetry and history is really interesting when it's like the writing about self. All sorts of great memoirs. None jump straight to my head, but like go to the cultural studies section at Readings and find the memoir little shelf, stuff like that. China Melville wrote a really great history of the Russian Revolution a few years ago. October, that's right, yeah. And it's a real narrative history. It's written like a novel. I think he's like a video game guy or whatever.
I think mostly he writes fiction, but he's written a few histories.
Yeah, and they're fantastic, and they are rigorous in a way. Like he doesn't just make stuff up. He does like as much as possible adhere to source material. But it's really well written. It's a cool story. And again, I think that's history at its best. None other ones really jump to my head, but I think other cultures do it better than we do. Like you think about like storytelling in Aboriginal Australia and like, the idea of the dream time and some of those stories that get told. A lot of the oral histories that exist in Indigenous communities are just fascinating. And again, I think are much more emotionally intelligent than, like Edward Gibbon's history of the Roman Empire and the decline of the Roman Empire, which I'm sure is a great work of scholarship. I've never been bothered to read it because why would you? It's boring, man. And I think other cultures who just kind of aren't trapped in this kind of literary technology that we're so trapped in. You talk about kids being glued to their phones and addicted to their phones. I feel like we're addicted to writing in a way. We've lost that art of that people before writing had of like just telling an interesting story that you'll tell someone and they'll want to remember and they'll want to tell their friends and their kids. And that's the art that we've lost in history, at least. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I love reading biographies.
Yeah.
Because I find them so much more digestible.
Yeah, totally.
But you still, the best for me is a biography written by an historian.
Yeah.
So someone like Judith Brett.
Yeah.
Who who's an Australian political historian, but recently wrote a biography of Alfred Deakin.
Yeah.
That was like honestly one of the best things I've read.
Yeah.
Because it was such a fantastic blend of like scholarship and narrative.
Yeah.
So I get where you're coming from completely.
So actually, two more. I mean, Peter Fitzsimmons' books are great examples. Again, I don't think I've actually read one, but I think he does that quite well. He tells interesting stories. Also, Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keith, which is a history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, built off oral history from different IRA soldiers, is really interesting. But yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on Ideas Matter, Dan.
No worries.
We'll probably have you back on as you finish your thesis to discuss the final form, where you land. So stay tuned. Is there anywhere, and if not, you can cut this out. Is there anywhere where you'd like to direct our listeners to stay tuned?
I think by the time this goes out, my comedy show will be finished. Nothing to do with the theory of history, luckily for my audiences. No, I think that'll be finished. But you can subscribe to my Substack. I write about some of this stuff and some other stuff. Hopefully, tell some engaging stories. It's called Some Writing. If you just look up Dan Crowley,
we'll put a link to Dan's Substack in the episode description.
Sick. No, apart from that, all good.
All right, awesome. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll see you soon.
Cool.
Peace.